Guy Gabaldon was born in East Los Angeles in 1926, the fourth of 7 children in a Mexican-American family with very little money. He was tough, independent, and mostly on his own from a young age. By 10, he was shining shoes on the streets of Los Angeles to help feed the family. And somewhere in those streets, a boy of about 12 fell in with a Japanese-American family named Nakano, and effectively became one of their children. He moved in with them, he ate their food, learned their customs, and picked up their language, a rough, colloquial, everyday Japanese, the Japanese of a household, not a textbook. That accident of childhood would, a few years later, save more than 1,000 lives. Then came Pearl Harbor, and the war reached into the Nakano home. Like roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent on the West Coast, most of them American citizens, the Nakano family was forced from their home and sent to an incarceration camp. The 2 Nakano sons, American-born, went on to serve the United States in the famous Japanese-American 442nd Regiment, even as their family sat behind barbed wire, and young Guy Gabaldon, the Mexican-American boy they had taken in, was left more or less on his own again, now carrying, without knowing it yet, the one thing that would define his life: an ear for Japanese, and a heart that saw Japanese people as human beings, not as an enemy race. When the war came for him, Gabaldon tried to enlist and was at first turned away. He was too young and too small. But in 1943, at 17, he talked his way into the United States Marine Corps. He trained as a scout and for amphibious landings, and because he could speak some Japanese, the Marines used him as an interpreter. He was a difficult, headstrong young Marine who did not much like taking orders. But he had one quality his superiors could not train into anyone. He was not afraid, in a war of unspeakable racial hatred on both sides, to see the man on the other side as a person he might talk to. In June 1944, he landed on Saipan with the 2nd Marine Division. Almost as soon as he was ashore, Gabaldon did something that could have gotten him court-martialed or killed. On his own initiative, without orders, he began slipping out of the American lines at night, alone, into the no-man's land where the Japanese were dug in. His officers were furious. A lone Marine wandering off in the dark was, by every rule, a fool about to die or be captured. But Gabaldon came back, and he came back with prisoners. The first night he brought in 2, the next, more. He had discovered something the whole American war machine had missed, that the enemy, given a real choice between death and life, would sometimes choose life, if someone they could understand offered it to them. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. Gabaldon worked out a method, and it was audacious. He would creep up on a cave or a bunker in the dark, deal with the sentries, capturing them, or when he had to, shooting them, and then he would call into the position in Japanese. He would tell them he had them surrounded. He would tell them his fellow Marines would use flamethrowers and roast them alive if they kept fighting, but that if they came out, they would be treated with honor, given water and medical care, and allowed to live. It was a bluff wrapped around a genuine promise, and crucially, he spoke to them not in the stiff Japanese of a military interpreter, but in the warm, rough, familiar Japanese of a family, the Japanese of the Nakano household. It made him sound like one of their own. It kept working, but the island around him was descending into something close to hell. By early July, the Japanese defense of Saipan was collapsing, and their commanders prepared for a final hopeless gesture. On the night of the 7th of July, the Japanese launched the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. Thousands of soldiers, including the wounded and the barely armed, hurling themselves at the American lines in a human wave meant to die gloriously rather than surrender. The charge was shattered. Thousands of Japanese were killed. And in the days that followed, the horror deepened as the island's trapped civilians began doing the unthinkable, choosing death over a surrender they had been taught to fear. This is the part of the Saipan story that is almost too painful to tell, and we will tell it carefully and briefly, because the people it happened to deserve that. Convinced by their own government's propaganda that the Americans would torture them, and that death was more honorable than capture, large numbers of Japanese civilians on Saipan, men, women, and whole families, took their own lives in the final days of the battle, often at the island's high cliffs. American troops watched, horrified and helpless, and tried to stop it and often could not. Thousands died this way. It is one of the great tragedies of the war, And it is the exact horror that Guy Gabaldon spent every night trying, one cave and one family at a time, to prevent. Against that tide of death, Gabaldon kept walking into the caves. Word had spread among the Marines about the strange young private who disappeared at night and came back leading columns of prisoners, and his officers had stopped trying to stop him. On the 8th of July, the morning after the great Banzai charge, with the island littered with the aftermath of the battle, Gabaldon approached a cliff face honeycombed with caves, where he believed hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians were hiding. He was, as usual, essentially alone. What he did that morning would become legend, but first he had to survive walking up to it. What happened at that cliff is the heart of this story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, we're just getting to it. Gabaldon captured a couple of Japanese soldiers near the caves, and instead of marching them back, he did something extraordinary. He sent them back in. He told them to go down into the caves and tell the others what he was offering: surrender, safety, food, water, their lives, and to bring out anyone who would come. Then he waited, alone, outside a cliff full of armed enemy soldiers, betting his life that his voice and his promise were stronger than their orders to die. It was, he later admitted, a moment of near panic. He had no idea if he was about to be shot, or overwhelmed, or obeyed. And then the Japanese began to come out. Not a handful, a stream. Soldiers and civilians climbed up out of the darkness, blinking in the daylight, and instead of attacking the lone Marine, they gathered around him and surrendered to him. There were so many that Gabaldon, completely outnumbered, had to think fast to keep control. He ordered them to separate into groups, and then to separate the sick and wounded, buying himself time and keeping them organized. One teenager, quietly running a crowd of hundreds of enemy soldiers who could have killed him in an instant, and instead did exactly as he asked. At one point, a Japanese soldier looked up the hill and said to him, almost in warning, "Marine, look at the American soldiers." Up on the ridge above, a group of Marines had stopped and were staring down at the scene below in disbelief. A single one of their own, standing in a sea of surrendered Japanese, calmly organizing them into columns. They came running down to help him secure the enormous crowd of prisoners. When it was counted, Guy Gabaldon had brought in around 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians in a single day. It was a number that defied belief. His company commander, Captain John Schwabe, later said that this tough kid from the East L.A. slums had, in one morning, captured 10 times as many prisoners as the legendary Sergeant Alvin York took in the First World War. Schwabe started calling him the Pied Piper of Saipan, and he put Gabaldon in for the Medal of Honor. Gabaldon did not stop at Saipan. When the 2nd Marine Division moved on to invade the neighboring island of Tinian, he took his method with him, walking into more caves and talking hundreds more Japanese into surrendering. In his own memoir, which he pointedly titled Saipan, Suicide Island, he described the moment the last of a huge group of soldiers, civilians, and wounded finally came in to be detained, and he realized what he had pulled off. My God, he remembered thinking, it's over, I did it. By the time his war on those islands was finished, Guy Gabaldon is credited with the surrender of roughly 1,500 enemy soldiers and civilians. More prisoners, it is widely believed, than any single American serviceman took in the entire war. The war was not finished with him. Sent back to Saipan to help hunt down the Japanese holdouts who were still hiding in the hills, Gabaldon was caught in an ambush and badly wounded, cut down by enemy fire, and evacuated to a hospital in Hawaii. He survived, but his combat days were over. He was still a teenager. He had walked into the enemy's caves alone, dozens of times, and talked more than 1,000 men and women out of dying, and he came home with the wounds to prove how close to death he had walked every single time. And then, having done something almost without parallel in American military history, he ran into something he had not expected: doubt. Some of the numbers seemed too big to believe. A few Marine veterans of the Pacific, men who knew how fanatically the Japanese resisted and how rare a single prisoner was, openly questioned whether one young private could really have brought in so many. The exact count has been argued over ever since. His own Navy Cross citation credits him with well over 1,000. Some accounts say 1,500, and a few skeptics insisted it must have been fewer. But here is what is not in dispute. His own company commander, who was there, believed him enough to recommend him for the nation's highest honor. And whatever the precise number, it was a staggering, unprecedented feat, achieved not with a weapon, but with a promise the enemy chose to trust. The Medal of Honor recommendation was turned down. Instead, Guy Gabaldon was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on Saipan and Tinian. A high honor, but far below what his commander had asked for, and, many have argued ever since, far below what he had earned. Gabaldon went home to Southern California, took off the uniform, and became, in his own words, just another regular Joe, driving a truck, getting on with an ordinary life. The Pied Piper of Saipan, the teenager who had captured more of the enemy than anyone in the war, faded back into the anonymous crowd of returning veterans. For more than a decade, almost no one outside his own unit knew what he had done. Then, one night in 1957, the country found out all at once. Gabaldon was brought onto a popular national television program that surprised ordinary people by celebrating their forgotten deeds, and his astonishing story was told to millions of Americans for the first time. Suddenly, the Pied Piper of Saipan was famous. 3 years later, in 1960, Hollywood made a film of his life. Though in the way of Hollywood then, they cast a tall, non-Hispanic actor to play the small Mexican-American Marine. A month after the film came out, the Marine Corps upgraded his Silver Star to the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor the Navy can give. But the campaign to get him what his commander had first asked for was only beginning. For the rest of his life, and long after, people argued that Guy Gabaldon deserved the Medal of Honor, that if a young man who captured a couple of hundred prisoners with a rifle would have received it, then a young man who saved more than 1,000 lives with his voice surely had. Supporters pointed out, quietly, and then not so quietly, that a poor Mexican-American Marine in the 1940s had not been given the same benefit of the doubt that others received. The campaign to upgrade his award went on for decades, taken up by veterans, by Latino civil rights advocates, and by filmmakers. It has never fully succeeded. To this day, Guy Gabaldon does not have the Medal of Honor, and to this day many people believe that is a wrong that has never been put right. He lived a long and restless life, married, raised a large family, spent years in Mexico and later in Florida, and never stopped telling his story or fighting for recognition. Not really for himself, he said, but for all the Hispanic Americans whose service the country had overlooked. In 2005, the Pentagon formally honored Gabaldon and other Hispanic veterans of the Second World War. In 2006, Guy Gabaldon died of a heart attack at the age of 80. 2 years later, a documentary made by people determined that he not be forgotten carried his story to a new generation under a fitting title, East L.A. Marine. The boy from the slums who had talked an enemy out of dying was, at last, becoming impossible to forget. Guy Gabaldon of East Los Angeles was 18 years old when he walked into the enemy's caves, alone, and talked more than 1,000 human beings out of dying. The most prisoners, it is believed, ever taken by a single American in the history of the country's wars. He did it with a few words of household Japanese, learned from a family his own nation had locked behind barbed wire, and with a stubborn refusal to believe that the man on the other side was only an enemy. He carried the Navy Cross, not the Medal of Honor many still think he earned. He died in 2006, at 80. And somewhere out there are the descendants of hundreds of Japanese men, women and children who lived to go home, and to have children and grandchildren, because a teenager from the slums decided they did not have to die. On an island where an entire population had been taught that the enemy was a monster, and where thousands chose death rather than find out otherwise, one 18-year-old Marine walked up to the caves unarmed of everything but his voice, and proved the propaganda wrong simply by keeping his word. Guy Gabaldon captured more of the enemy than anyone in American history, and he did it by refusing to treat them as the enemy at all. People still argue about whether Guy Gabaldon should fairly receive the Medal of Honor, and about how many other heroes like him, Hispanic, Black, Native American, Japanese American, were quietly passed over in their time. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served on Saipan, in the Marianas, or anywhere in the Pacific, in any branch or any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. The men and women who lived because of people like Guy Gabaldon deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.